Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today at Venture Cafe. My name is Angela McQuillan, and I'm the curator of the Esther Klein Gallery at the Science Center. I'm really excited to introduce our guest today. I think you're all in for a real treat. So Sophie is based in New York City. I first met her when she was featured in a 3-person exhibition at Esther Klein Gallery called Phantom Limb. I think that was in 2018, curated by Danielle Ezzo. And I had seen her work online prior to the show, but this experience was the first time I'd actually seen her work in person. Sophie makes really beautiful, classically inspired sculptures and videos using digital techniques, such as 3D scanning and 3D printing, and also creates work that combines this modern technology with ancient bronze casting techniques. I really love the way that Sophie's work explores the glitches in digital technology and uses this as a way to sort of depict the unstable and constantly moving human form. So Sophie has exhibited her sculptural and video work all over the world, including New York, Los Angeles, London, Paris, Sydney, and Tokyo. She's also taught in the Department of Digital Arts at Pratt Institute as a visiting associate professor and at Columbia College in Chicago as a visiting instructor. Her work has been supported by the Australia Council for the Arts, the Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center at Rensselaer Polytechnic, and other private funders. Her work is held in public and private collections in the US and internationally, and she's also a 2011 New York Foundation for the Arts Digital and Electronic Arts Fellow. So with that, now I'd like to welcome our guest, Sophie Kahn.
All right, hi everybody, I'm happy to be here. Angela, I'm going to start a timer for 30 minutes, if that sounds about right.
Sounds great.
That'll keep me on target. Okay, so let me just start my screen share. Okay, we'll go back to the beginning. All right, so can everybody see the screen? Awesome. Okay, so one of the first questions I get asked is, how did you get into 3D scanning and 3D printing? And the answer is so lengthy, I am going to speed talk and zoom my way through it. But I think the backstory kind of helps you put the rest of my work in context. So I did my undergrad at Goldsmiths in London, 2001. I graduated. I studied photography, and it was the great tragedy of my adolescence that I had no manual drawing or painting skill whatsoever, and I was desperate to be an artist. And it wasn't until I was about 14 that I picked up a camera, and the mode of going out into the world and gathering and bringing it home and editing made so much more sense to me than the idea of kind of starting from scratch. From a blank canvas, if you will. So I love photography, and I did it for a very long time, but this in my undergrad was the era of Andreas Gursky, which is this image that we're looking at now. The God's eye view, the mechanical eye, depopulated human spaces. That was the buzzword when I was in school doing photography. The work that I loved was the total polar opposite of that. This is an image by Francesca Woodman. I loved work that came from the human scale, from the eye, that was embodied at ground level and was about the instability of the camera. Its kind of glitches, its motion blur, and its failures. So I loved photography, but I felt really out of step with the art world. So after I graduated, I enrolled in a program called Spatial Information Architecture. To this day, I actually cannot quite define that. Like, please don't ask me. People say, what is your degree? And I say, I don't quite know. But it was a collaborative project between artists and architects. And the head of my department, fortunately enough, was Mark Burry, a New Zealand architect who was tasked with rebuilding the Sagrada Familia, Gaudi's famously unfinished cathedral in Barcelona. So I told you this was a long story. They had a 3D scanner and a 3D printer back in 2003 when nobody did except universities and industries. And I'm not a tinkerer. I'm not an artist who builds tools to make art. You know, I don't have that aptitude either. I just want to make the work. And I have the utmost respect for people who build tools, but it's not me. And so I was really fortunate in that at this time, I was actually able to access this stuff directly, because the only other people who could were using these very DIY 3D printers like the RepRap. So this is the scanner that they used at the lab. I actually still use it to this day. It's getting pretty ancient. I'm kind of hoarding parts on eBay to keep, you know, in case they die. It's mostly used for objects. So here you can see it being used to scan the original Star Wars props from the 70s movies to bring into the digital animation. They use it on Harry Potter. They use it an awful lot in architecture and medicine. What they don't use it for is people. And it's really, from a technical point of view, it does a pretty miserable job of scanning a person. I'm just going to show you a really quick video of the scanner in operation, and we should not have sound here. I'm just speaking over it. The way that it works is that it shines a laser line over the person's face. It has a magnetic locator that triangulates the position of this handset that I'm holding and the person. And there's a video in the handset, this little ray gun contraption that I have here, a video camera that is recording the way that that line changes as it moves over a curved surface. And you can see it building up the model on my screen. So that then yields 3D data that I can take and sculpt and work with. So it does a pretty awful job at this though, from a technical perspective. I'll just show you one more. Because anytime a human being shifts around in space, if they breathe, if they even kind of, you know, wobble a little tiny bit during a scan, which might be a 5 or 10 minute process, the scanner yields a whole lot of error. You get overlap. It's really what I think of as a 3D motion blur. So I said to the tech at the lab, what happens if I use it wrong? If I scan a person? He goes, ugh. You don't want to do that. You just get these chunks, these gross digital data chunks floating in space. It's a mess. And my eyes sort of lit up as an artist. And I said, show me the chunks, you know, bring it on. So this was one of my very first face scans at, you know, I was like 22, 23 years old. And it has, anyone who's in this field can see that this is a miserable scan technically. There are all these errors that fascinated me though. So there's gaps under the nose, there's gaps due to occlusion here where the scanner can't get a good angle, there's gaps under the chin. And if you imagine, if you were to take a photograph of my face from that angle, those are all the things that you wouldn't see. So it's almost a map. To me, it felt like a map of the incompleteness of a photograph. And as a photographer, who was so interested in the frailty and the failure of human vision, to me, this felt like a way to spatialize that and to make it real. It was almost like you took a photograph and then you rotated it around and you could see all the places that the photograph hadn't quite managed to capture. It also, this is the other thing in my work that I've been kind of dealing with to this day, it reminded me of a death mask. You've got to close your eyes to protect them from the scanner. It's not particularly eye safe. It doesn't capture any skin tone, so any kind of ethnicity is lost. It's rendered in this default white, which is kind of pretty problematic. I'm going to talk about that later. And you have to hold so still that you end up with this serene, haunted sort of a look. And so there's always been this question in my work of the unintended emotional resonance of the technological image. Basically, the fact that anything you make digitally is going to have a sort of strange, haunted, eerie quality. So I've been trying to pull that out ever since. For a long time, I really could not materialize my work as sculpture. I made these large prints because I graduated, lost access to my scanner. I only had this data on my hard drive and I was borrowing scanners here and there, you know, once a year where I could. I sort of felt like I was a photographer who had no camera for a long time. And it really was not until 2010 or so 2011, when the market shifted, companies like Shapeways came on the scene, software like NetFab emerged, and for the first time, instead of having to pay an engineer $100 an hour to work on my files and having to find some factory that did stereolithography and paying like $1,000 for a wax print, all of a sudden this was really cheap and really easy, and it was so thrilling as an artist to be able to actually have a hand in the making of my work. So at this point, I enrolled in grad school at SEIC in Chicago, and I made a lot of these sculptural death masks just using different 3D printing technologies. Because I was really referencing the languages of art history, I wanted to make them in kind of classical materials. So I spent a lot of time at SEIC learning bronze and casting and mold making, which honestly I'm also fairly terrible at. But I enjoyed the material era, and the combination of the material era and the digital era has always been a really rich vein for me. So this piece, you see the lines from the 3D print rather, all these little build lines are kind of the, imperfection of the 3D print. And then there are all these wax globs and scratches, and her ear's wonky, things went wrong in the casting too, because I'm using a whole lot of equipment against the grain in a way that it's really not meant to be used. So each piece became an accumulation of its workflow and showed all the traces of everything that had happened to it up until that stage. This is a clay piece. I'm going to skim over some of this to get to the newer work, but there is one proposal I wanted to mention where I've read an essay by Tom McCarthy. He's a British artist and author, and his argument is that technology and death are inextricably linked. He talks about Alexander Graham Bell, and at the time of the invention of the telephone, he thought maybe you could use it to communicate with the dead. He was probably joking, but there was a real overlap between spiritualism and science at that time, that it was more porous than it is today. He talks about the fact that by generating digital archives in our death anxiety that motivates us to use all these recording technologies, paradoxically, we're building my own tombs. And so they're our own tombs. So this was a proposal for my tomb, unrealized to this day, thank goodness, in more ways than one. And then I really wanted to scale my work up. More and more I actually realized that I kind of was an object maker at heart. And so I started researching one of the few places that you see sculpture outside the art world, which is in the cemetery. Particularly, I got really interested in these representations of women in European cemeteries. There's a great book called Saving Graces that talks about this in more detail. But the real female figures memorialized there are very chaste and very demure. But then the representations of grief and mourning are super racy, very hysterical, draped in these kind of reclining attitudes. And it's this weird nexus of death and sex going on in a religious context that kind of piqued my curiosity. So that was one main interest that I pulled into the work. And I'm always pulling in a lot of other sources. So I come from a background of disability and chronic illness, thankfully past. But the motif of the sleeping woman has been a long-standing one in my work. And also a kind of medical history. And then I was looking at, I'm sure everybody's seen this by now. I need to pull in one of those, the images of the Instagram models that are 3D and look so realistic you think it's a real person. But the Uncanny Valley, basically it's the same idea, the futility of technology, that as we approach verisimilitude, as we approach a really perfect representation of the human body using tech, paradoxically it becomes more and more repulsive. And so we see that the 3D movie industry is very much backed away from trying to do real people because audiences were so disgusted by it. And now all we have is kind of cartoon characters and over the top, like real caricature and little animals, because that's okay in 3D, but this stuff was just upsetting, really. The last thing I was looking at was the classical fragment, because I also got excited about the fact that for the first time, I was dealing with like data off the screen. It was a real object. It was a 3D print. It might break. It might fall over. It was a fragment. There are so many challenges in how you present it. And I spent my entire MFA arguing about pedestals and trying to figure out, how do I support these funny floating fragments when they're real things? And I looked at a lot of archaeology. I did a show, first of all, right across the road from the Art Institute of Chicago, where I worked with the museum mount maker from the Art Institute, from the Greek and Roman galleries, I should say. The show was called Artifact, so it was the double play on the classical artifact, the digital artifact. They were these kind of fragmented shapes, and maybe from a distance they looked like a classical statue, and then you get close and you see they're plastic. And that any damage that's been wrought to them, it's not like a Michael Rakowitz installation where he's brought rocks back from Iraq that, you know, have been bombed, or, you know, there's history, time, floods, fire. The damage is digital, and it's modern and deliberate and specific. So I wanted to play with the audience's expectations somewhat. This is maybe the best representation from that series, by the way, of this like triple motion blur effect that I was talking about. With this model, we actually scanned her face, turn, scan, turn, scan. And so you get this like Duchamp nude descending a staircase accretion of time built up in a single image. But after that, you know, I felt like the classicism, there are so many artists that have contended with the museum and the classical and done it so well. I sort of felt like it wasn't, that territory had kind of run out for me. And so I turned my research to something a little more specific, which was hysteria in 19th century Paris. So I'm sure everyone's heard that term, completely discounted now. At the time, though, very, very, very prevalent. And it was a diagnosis applied mostly to women. Also, interestingly enough, to men returning from World War I. They were called male hysterics, and they were suffering from what we would now call PTSD. These women who were locked up in these asylums may have had schizophrenia, they may have had epilepsy, they may have had a range of neurological disorders. But again, so the boundary between medicine and science and entertainment was pretty porous too in this time in history. And so Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot at this asylum would host these teaching lectures that the public attended. And he would have women, he would electroshock them. He would use a device called an ovarian compressor. It's a pretty nasty history. And he would get them to elicit these signs of hysteria. They would go through basically a choreography that he developed on cue, step by step. And it's a very, very interesting question as to how complicit they were. Were they performing? Were they sick? There's a lot of material out there that I don't have time to dwell on, but it's really intriguing. Anyway, the thing that got me about it in particular, because so many artists have mined hysteria, like it's a 70s feminist canon. Louise Bourgeois did this beautiful piece. You know, like what can you say about it? But I was interested in the way that technology was used to try and capture something completely ineffable, like madness. How can you capture madness? How can you use the device of the camera, the scanner, anything to try and pin down something like that? And so that kind of felt like something I'd been really trying to interrogate in my work, is using a device in a way that it wasn't designed to be used to reveal its limit and working at its limit. So I 3D scanned a whole troupe of models, dancers, used myself for some of these. And for the first iteration, I made these small sculptures. The series is called Prodromes. They are all titled after the phase of the hysterical attack that the model's reenacting. So the phrases are just amazing. It's the period of delirium, the period of passionate attitudes, the period of clownism is one of my favorites. And we worked off these diagrams and kind of re-performed them in a way. And what the other thing, and this is another like instance of a funny thing that I've discovered along the way in my digital practice that I've loved, something that often people discard, but that I've made a central part of the practice. I was playing with prototyping these, and I found this software that generates these supports. These are, sorry, I'm just answering a quick chat. This is the software creates this to hold up a molten plastic print as it's curing, basically, because if you imagine it's quite a slow process, at least when you're using what's called fused deposition modeling. If people haven't seen these 3D printers, you can just imagine like a robotically controlled cake decorator. The bag squirts out a liquid and lays it down. And it's got to have something to hold it up while it sets. And I was stressed over this problem of like, how do you present these? How do you put them on pedestals? How do you just hold them up and deal with them as real world objects when they're no longer data? And then I had these figures that were unstable. The whole metaphor was instability, like psychic instability, emotional instability. So I came across these supports, and it was another like eureka moment for me. So sorry, I had a question earlier about these, how these were made. These are all 3D printed in laser sintered nylon. The first version, I wasn't so thrilled with the bases. I couldn't actually get a file out because it was proprietary, and so I had a fabricator design these in water jet cut aluminum, and it wasn't as intricate as I wanted. I've always found that 3D printing is the only way that I can really make the geometry that I make. But finally I cracked it after about 1.5 years of experimentation. And I found software that generated these immensely like beautiful, intricate, delicate architectural supports. So I can probably talk about this a little more if people are curious, because it's such an interesting question with work that's generative, and when you work like kind of like collaborating, quote unquote, with a machine, what you're coming up with and what the machine is coming up with. So they're generated, but they're also like heavily edited and rearranged. And I'll generate them 30 times before I'm happy with them. So there's a lot of human intervention. These are large prints, by the way. I call them the blueprints. And I guess, again, it's like this architectural metaphor, this idea of applying the architectural tools to the body. The idea of like making a blueprint, but for a woman, you know, for a human being, not a building. And what would that mean? And why would you want to do that? What does it imply? You know, it looks like her body is under construction. Her body is this project that's never ending. Maybe it's being demolished. Maybe it's a monument that's being erected. Maybe it's like a church that's falling down that's being kind of propped and conserved. It was just a really rich metaphor to it. So yeah, this was my last complete body of work. It's entitled Prodromes. It was exhibited at Bitforms in October 2018. This is one of the largest pieces that I made. So this is a life-size female figure from the Prodrome series, scan of a modern dancer, I should say, actually, from Columbia College in Chicago. And this is what it looked like when I got it out of the box from the factory. So 24 more pieces, me and my fabricator, it took us a month. And he is very, very skilled. He was like the second guy up at MakerBot for a long time. It was Gulliver, yeah, Gulliver's Travels. I like that one. It took us, it's like the world's worst jigsaw puzzle. You're just puzzling over like diagrams and the laptop and just, really, really struggling. But we got it glued together. And then I decided to paint it. And there were a few factors there. Like number one, this material yellows. It doesn't actually get brittle, but it yellows. It picks up pollution from the atmosphere. And collectors don't like that. They don't want to buy something plastic that's going to change color, which I completely respect. But also, I have people might have heard this theory about mirror neurons, that as you look at painting, the part of your brain that knows how to work a paintbrush becomes activated. And in a way, you're imagining you're creating those brush strokes. You're doing that, you're executing that. And I just don't think yet that we have mirror neurons for 3D modeling. So I think that there was like a real remoteness, and there was a struggle. I heard this a lot in grad school. People had a hard time connecting with the work that I was making, and I really wanted it to be emotional and expressive, and it still felt very chilly. Again, it's like, tech failure. but I wanted to be a little generous and kind of throw the audience a bit of a bone and say, these are the choices that I made as an artist. I also really loved painting them. It was nice to have that hand, and it felt like I was humanizing a digital object. So yeah, this was the final result for that piece. It's installed at Bitforms with a work by Susan Silas. This is some other pieces from that same series. They're smaller. I wish they could all have been life-size or actually even monumental. That's really my dream, public art scale, one day. And then these were also shown at C24 Gallery in Chelsea the following January. Oh, sorry, I doubled up on these. So I'm just going to check the time because the latest series, okay, 7 minutes. For my latest series, which is still fairly kind of incomplete, it's another kind of research-based, starts with research. And this time I got really interested in Butoh, which is an experimental form of dance that originated in Japan. It's really pretty global at this point. The very pat version of it is that it was inspired by the trauma of kind of post-World War II of Hiroshima. I was really drawn to it because the body in Butoh is so expressive, so fraught, and so kind of activated, and there's so much kind of pain in these bodies, and it's really the opposite of the ballet body. It's not perfect and graceful. It's not making it look easy. A lot of the performers are in their 70s and 80s, and you can feel the suffering. And you know, one of my most favorite performers has a, you know, falls onto the stage and you hear the crack, like it's loud, and it's kind of all about the failure of the body. So I got really intrigued by this. I did a residency at Pioneer Works in Brooklyn and did so much research and brought in Butoh dancers to scan. This is one of the resulting works. This is a really large print. It's kind of 80 inches high. I also really wanted to pull it back to an idea of like exploring the idea of what happens when the body becomes an avatar, when the body is removed from its physical form and sent across the internet ether, and almost to add like a strange quasi-religious twist to that, like thinking of that as the soul being separated from the body. And I was using this very kind of explicit tombstone memorial language, using like granite and stone, and making these things. Some of these are quite small. I almost was inspired by kind of columbaria, which is where you'd find urns interred within a cemetery. And then some of them are kind of look more like tombstones. This show was going up the week that lockdown happened, and it was being installed at SVA. And we had so many delays. We lost all our techs to quarantine. It's not finished. And I was actually so thrilled that the show was cancelled. It's your dream as an artist. You have a show that you're really unhappy with, and then, you know, you have a watertight excuse to not show that work. So I'm going to revisit it, because there's a lot of other choices that I want to make. And then now I think also, especially with global events, like the idea of the memorial and of how we remember the dead and how we grieve and how we collect people's data and images online to remember them. I think there's going to be kind of a shift in that, and it's something that I want reflected in the work. I want to consider very thoughtfully. But that's kind of takes us up to the present day. So all those pieces are granite. They're stuck at SVA for who knows how long, but I mean, they're granite, they're not going anywhere. The rest is stuck at my studio in Times Square, and who knows how I'm going to get to Times Square, but I'm figuring it out. I'm trying to work out how my practice is going to work for the next 12 months, like I assume a lot of people are. So yeah, that's where we're up to.
That was awesome, Sophie. Thank you.
Thank
Um,
you.
I have a question for you. So most of your work is not life-size. How difficult is it, or was it, to make that life-size piece? And what are like the challenges you face when you do that?
It's just really expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's most of it, in all honesty. And and it's not even so much the material, because, you know, doing that in bronze would be 4 times as much. But it's a really, for me, I found it's a really peculiar niche that my work occupies. And I'm happy with where I'm at in my career, but I've always really struggled with like where it sits in the art world, and particularly in relationship to the art market, because I would love to have a massive production budget. And there are definitely sculptors out there who do. I'd love for it to be public, but most of it is like a little dark for public art. And so it sort of takes the right partner, the right institutional partner, to kind of help you make something on that scale. It's, you know, and I'm, like I said, I'm in this funny point between the digital art market, which is very poorly funded. Like nobody in tech companies is investing in art. They're not buying digital art, you know. And between the traditional, quote unquote, traditional art world, which more and more each year is embracing technology and understanding it, but there's still reticence, particularly when you're working with these materials. There's all these worries about the archival qualities. But that's just starting to shift too. And a few years ago, the Whitney bought its the first 3D printed piece. So it's really just funding. Yeah, it's funding that's the main barrier.
Yeah.
But it's that's really what I'm working towards. And I'm trying to, in the meantime, I'm trying to do other work, you know, on a scale that I can, and do very large prints, or like consider projections, or little maquettes. But yeah, the dream for sure would be to make all the work really massive.
I could definitely see your work as a public piece.
I would love to. Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions for Sophie? All right. So I was wondering, when you scan a body, what degree of manipulation do you do to that file? And do you make like conscious choices on what glitches to leave out?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it sort of comes back to like how I work as a photographer, because, you know, I think that a photographer kind of goes out and isn't entirely in control of what's going to end up on the film at the end of the day, but they might take 100 photographs, and then there's a real like editorial process that happens. And I kind of work in that same way. Like when I'm scanning, a lot of my brain is really just like trying to make sure that the equipment's working, that I'm backing up my data, that I'm getting like anything at all. Although I do really try to step back and like not intervene too much. And like, funnily enough, there were times when I had tried to get my husband to do like body scans of me, and he's an engineer, and I was like, look, just be really loose, be really expressive, just don't worry about it, you know. And there were like these perfect stripes up and down, and the holes were like perfectly spaced. I'm like, no. But there's, to that point though, I recently did a residency at Mass MoCA, and like sat down for just 2 weeks, like no kids, no housework, no anything. It was total bliss. And learned ZBrush, which is sculpting software that lets you really intervene and alter the forms, like in pieces, parts of them. It's like it's made of clay, and you're pushing and pulling it with brushes. And I've never been able to do that before. And so I'm actually considering a whole new series of work that's about the manipulation of the body in the digital age, like in, you know, the Instagram filters that we see, the like Kim Kardashian, the, you know, photos of women where you see like the door frame is bent like that, like where they've kind of photoshopped it. I just, again, like that question of what happens to the avatar when you send it out into the world. And I have a whole series of portraits that fortunately I was able to scan before the quarantine, of models who'd been through body transformations of different kinds, surgeries, weight loss, pregnancy. One woman found out she was a BRCA carrier and had a preventative mastectomy, but she had me 3D scan her breasts first, and then bronze them and 3D print them and performs with them on stage, which is amazing. I can't take credit. That's her idea. Like, she's a performer. But I brought her back in post mastectomy and scanned her. So, and then the idea is that they will suggest changes to the bodies, and that I'll execute those changes in ZBrush. that's what I'm working on at the moment. So, but I haven't really done much of that until now. Like I've deleted things, I've edited things, but I haven't gone in and like changed the shape of like the waist or the leg or tilted the head or whatever. And now that's something I finally know how to do, which is really, really exciting.
That's really cool. So I was actually surprised when you said that humans are repulsed by these lifelike representations of ourselves, basically through technology. Why do you think that is?
It's a good question. And it's something that I think about in relationship to kind of the history of photography. Like there's so much from the 20s, I don't know, sorry, maybe I should say the 30s or 40s, that compares the photographic image to like a corpse or a zombie. There's that like Dorian Gray question of you have this image of yourself that remains like forever young and beautiful as your body ages. Just the eeriness of duplicating a human in any way is something that I'm really interested in. Just the fact that you copy yourself over and over and over again. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like, I do wonder if we have got to the other side of the uncanny valley now, because it's true. I look at those Instagram models who are not real, and it doesn't. Maybe we're so used to seeing that stuff now that it's not maybe upsetting to us in the same way. Like maybe there's a sort of uncanny valley fatigue that we've like accrued over time. But yeah, I think but then there's so much TV too around like the AI, the Android, the like Westworld, the whole thing of like engaging with something that's not human, that's a simulated human. So yeah, I don't know. I don't have a great answer, but I think that copying ourselves is a very strange thing, no
Yeah.
matter how it's done. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I can actually speak to that. I don't know if I ever talked to you about this, Sophie, but I wrote a
Oh, I
final
don't think we
paper.
did.
Last semester, I wrote one of my final papers for a digital art class on the Uncanny Valley, and
Did you?
yeah, I looked at some studies around it, and what a lot of those studies found is that it's an issue of conflicting cues that we're receiving. You're receiving the cues that it's a robot or a cartoon, and also that it's a human, and that's just inherently stressful to people because of just evolutionary things.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
a couple people have hypothesized that the reason it's becoming more and more acceptable is also because the category of digital entity is becoming a full category that's like accepted by humans. Yeah, not sure.
Oh, that's interesting. Send me that link. I want to read that paper now. Yeah, I mean, it's funny too. It's like there was a thing in the New York Times last week that was called like why Zoom is terrible, because my 10-year-old is on class in Zoom all day and it's miserable for her. She keeps saying, she's like, Mom, it's so much worse than being in school. It's so exhausting. At 12 noon, she comes down and her brain is just wiped out and she can sit through school all day. But the article talked about how like, the eyes, you're not actually making eye contact on a Zoom screen. You're filtering out lag. It's like tuning out the fluorescent lights. It's just tiring in a way that you're not aware of. But at the end of the day, you're like really fatigued mentally from it. So I've been thinking about that too, like telepresence not really being a pretty poor substitute, and like all the ways that our minds are not, kind of configured for it. So I feel like even real humans, but like broadcast, there's maybe that same problem that we have. Yeah.
Another thing that I was thinking about in relation to your work is and androids. Did you ever see the Bina 48 android?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about the relationship between technology and death, and the whole point of her is to upload the real human Bina's memories so that she would live on after Bina's death, which I think is like super creepy. But I don't know. I was just thinking about.
Yeah, I haven't had the chance to like actually like meet her. That Bitforms show though had Stephanie Dinkin's video, which is like where she's talking to Bina about race, and she says, "Who are your people? Where do you come from?" She told some great stories about Bina. She said sometimes she'd drive 3 hours to go see her and she'd be like in a really bad mood. She'd say, yeah, she just was cranky. She didn't want to talk to me, like she's like, that's my whole day. And Bina just wasn't having it. Bina just like told me to get lost,
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. It was a really interesting work from that. Yeah.
Cool. Well, we're approaching the 4 o'clock mark. Is there one last question that anyone wants to ask Sophie? Jason?
Hello. Hi, Sophie.
Hi, Jason. How you going?
Good. Thank you for this. First, by the way, it's great. So my question, I was thinking a lot as you were speaking about, as artists, we tend to find and exploit these limitations of new tools over time, right? Like I think about early video artists and Nauman flipping the camera or playing with proximity to the lens, or offsetting the audio. And I kind of see that connecting to the way that you were working with early 3D scanning, because you're one of the kind of the pioneers of using 3D scanning as an art form and embracing the glitches and the mistakes. So I don't know if there's a question there. Maybe, I don't know if is that the way that you kind of, do you see yourself aligning with that, or?
Yeah, definitely. And I should add that like my critiques probably like at this point, like for me to use that as a critique is like a bit dated because there are great scanners out there now. Like mine is not one of them.
Right.
I have a whole other category of like dinner party anecdotes that I've like, now that I'm released from my NDA, I can share at another time, but I used to work in the VFX industry doing scanning, and I worked on like Aquaman and some like Netflix shows and stuff, and we used the Artex scanners, and they are a lot better. But I don't know, it's funny, it's like I feel like I grew up like with the scanner that I have, and I'm so attached to it now, the glitches that it creates. So it's maybe, for me, it's like less about trying to like critique that particular device or critique the assumptions of the technology at large, and more just about like trying to explore like the beauty of its failure to kind of get some kind of human expression through that very staticky transmission. Yeah, I don't know, I've kind of, my thinking of it has now evolved because I'm no longer using anything that's like on the cutting edge. I'm using stuff that's kind of 10, 12 years out of date just because I love it. But yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking more about, I guess, in the beginning, because although you've been a long time, like I think that you were kind of thinking about it in a conceptual way, in that you were taking this technology and just trying to find the limitations that it might.
Yeah, and I definitely think that that's something that artists have been always kind of done really, really well, and like will continue to be successful in. But there's like so much to talk about in terms of like trying to keep tech work from feeling dated, because that's something that I'm always really afraid of. And like the first year of like art and technology seminar, we get shown all these pioneering new media works from their time that now are just apps, like beautiful, amazing transcendent piece that's like a video portal between London and Paris, and now that's Skype. Or a bike that you ride, it takes you on a virtual tour of all these worlds, and now my gym does that. So it's like, how do you, maybe your work doesn't need to speak to the ages necessarily, but I'm kind of obsessed with like history and like timelessness as well, and in trying to have it be out of time. Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, that's probably why I look so much at the 19th century stuff too, because I've done like a lot of work around like the dawn of photography and the dawn of cinema, because it did feel like that a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Sophie. This was amazing.
It was so fun.
I put your website address up here for everyone, so if you want to get in contact with Sophie, her website is in the chat.
Yeah, please do. I just want to add, I'm super happy. I'm like happy to see so many people I know from like different times of life, and like please get in touch. And if people have questions about 3D as well, I have like suffered so much in like dealing with the 3D learning curve, and it's been so painful that if anyone has questions about it, I really like want to spare you some pain. So I'm like really happy to help out with stuff, and I love doing this talk. They're like these types of talks, and it makes me feel less stuck in my house and less like trapped to a sink full of dishes. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody. Keep in touch. Bye bye.